Hey everybody, this is Brad Dyke saying hi, how you doing? And just having some discussions and doing some talking and with many of you. And one of you came up with a question. It said, I want to start to build my own home lab, my own PCIT home lab, that is, to be specific. And he wasn't sure exactly how would you start. And thought to myself, well, that's a great question, especially if you've never done this before. Um, the very first question I sent back to him, and I'm still waiting for feedback from him, is that when you're dealing with what you want to do, you ask the question, where would you put it? You know, what's the room? What's the dimension of the room that you're looking at? Is it going to be a hodgepodge rack combo in a closet, or is it going to be in part of your bedroom, or is it going to be in a room that's by itself? Is it going to be in a basement? Is it going to be in a garage? And, you know, when you're dealing with those kind of things, the next thing you want to ask, and it's related to the nature of how you would want to plan something out. You want to take the dimensions of your room, you want to take the ideas of what you want to do, and you want to look at the resources inside the room that can allow you to do it. So that's would be my three primary things. One, where are you going to put it? Two, what are you going to put in it? Three, what do you have in the room that can support this, or you may have to change so that you can build yourself a small area. Now, most of you have seen what I call the iconic style IT places that people will build their labs in. Surprisingly, a large number of them are in a closet. Now, don't get me wrong, not a great idea. The closet is a highly restricted area with a lot of enclosed space that's isolated. You don't want isolation. You want circulation. You want convection. So it's cool to tinker with, like, you know, if you have Raspberry Pis, oh, excuse me, or you have, you know, a small micro platform, then you can probably get away with that. The micro platforms are very tiny. You can get away with a single outlet from the wall to power, you know, 6 or 7, you know, targeted instances of equipment, and you can use those to make a Proxmox cluster, or you can build that as a Raspberry Pi environment or something like that. Yes, a closet isn't a bad idea, but keep them for well spaced apart so you can have micro convection zones for your stuff. Now, if you are using kind of like a small room, let's say a 10 by 5 foot room that's near an attic or up high, not the greatest places because heat rises. And if you've got your room up there, then all the heat in the house will gravitate in that area. Now, what I would say optimally, though, is if you can get yourself a room that is able to have one or two 20 amp endpoints, in other words, two receptacles coming from two different circuits. There'll be 15 amp load circuits, and that would provide you some distributed power. That would be valuable in that room too. But again, it goes back to the 3 rule guideline. I only have so much space. I'm going to do this with that space, and power and air circulation are going to be my requirements for that space. In other words, how much power do I have? Right? And by using power itself, it's going to tell you exactly what your limitations are. So that's what we're going for. These 3 rules teach you your limitations of what you can do. It can help prevent you from doing unnecessary work because you underscaled or overscaled what you wanted to do. What you want to get is something in there within what we call the 80-20 rule. 80% ready to go with 20% growth down the road. Now, with that being the case, you might discover that the initial place you were going to look to host your equipment isn't really optimum. Well, why? Because if you go up high, you have a attic like room, right? And that attic room is hot. It's going to be hot. So IT is not going to like that. And you're going to have to add HVAC or tap into your air conditioning and pump air in there to at least circulate air so that you can kind of keep it under control. Now that requires some work, and depending on how far you're away from your current HVAC connections, and or you can even get to those, it might not be an advisable thing to do. So what do you do? Well, okay, you want to get cheap, get all the space you want, flexibility as well as what I call room. Go for the basement. Now, understand that if you go for the basement, excuse me, if you go for the basement, you want to raise the surface area up to a certain point. Now let me give you an example of what I mean. When you look down here at this rack placement, you see that I've got hardware all the way down to the ground. And I want to use that as an advantage. But this is not a basement. In a basement environment, if you look at my alternate rack, you would find out very quickly that I would have at least 2 feet off the ground in the clear in my 42U rack. Now, the reason why I put 2 feet of clearance in my basement rack is because I want to make sure if the basement begins to flood, that all the primary power requirements are above that 2-foot marker. Because that will allow you to get down there very carefully, very quickly, secure your gear, make sure it's all powered off effectively and not at risk. Because that's an important detail about basements. They flood. So, you have to plan for how the weather is going to affect you, the elements are going to affect you, and what potential problems can occur. Now, what's better than that? Well, obviously, unless you've got a hole in your roof, a garage, a side garage, or something with a concrete patio, as I have here in my lab, is the next most optimal. Now, before I leave the basement idea, it's still not a bad idea. Especially if you take a fan and you take what's called a rotary tilt fan and you shoot it, put it right in the bottom of your rack and shoot it straight up. Now what that does is it gives you cheap HVAC cooling power. It allows you to circulate air over the concrete of the basement or the floor of the basement, maybe brick and so on. It's a natural cooling effect and it keeps air circulated. Now convection is important, like I said earlier. Know your space, know what you want to build, and know your resources, right? Space tells you how much air you can move. What you want to put in that space will tell you how much is left over to move airspace so convection can do its job. Now remember, convection exists, period. And what I mean by that is, if you look at a heat sink, this is a heat sink here, it's actually designed in the model of convection. Down here you have the heat, and the heat rises and travels through the pipe, and as it goes up and it hits a cooler area by these copper fans, it then begins to cool down. Once it cools down, it goes back down to the bottom as basically more of a liquid than a gas, and it goes for more heat, and it goes this process over and over. Well, convection effects is the same with air. Because if you noticed about air is the actual medium doing all the work, not the heat sink. All the heat sink is doing is absorbing heat. The air comes in and says, hey, I'll take this heat and I'll take it off. And I'll move it into the air because that's the nature of convection. Heat rises, cool air drops, right? And that's what you're trying to create. So if you're in a basement, you can take an angle type style fan, shoot it straight up from the floor, force that flow of cool air going up and push the hot air out. And as the hot air goes away from the rack, it will cool and drop down to the floor and rinse the repeat process. Now I do something similar to that, but as you can see here, concrete slabs ability to transfer heat, or BTUs, from a high temperature to a cool temperature will need some help. And if you notice right over there, it's right there on the side, I have an HVAC unit, which is a really nice HVAC unit that brings about the balance of coolness in the room and circulation. Now what does that basically mean in a nutshell to you? Well, if you can put your gear in a basement and it's well cared for and it's in good shape, then it's an excellent place to use what we call passive cooling. In other words, whatever your equipment's running, that's it. You don't need anything else. Why? Because you see, the basement is below the ground level of the area. So therefore, it's going to be more compliant to the 53-degree temperature range of the surface area on the bottom. So what you can do to find that out is you take yourself a thermal sensor like this one, and you shoot the thermal instance down there. And when you do that, that instance will then turn around and it will give you the ability to tell you how much temperature is on the floor. And that's how you know you've got a cool floor in your basement. But also what you want to do is you want to take a hum temp sensor as well and test the humidity in the room as well. Now, surprisingly, believe it or not, with today's technology, I'd say going about 10 years back, does pretty well with a little higher humidity. At what we call, in the old days of low humidity or high humidity, you have the risk of static discharges, which would damage your electronics. But today's electronics is a lot more resilient and more capable than that, and they're quite functional, even in a higher humid environment. And by doing that, your basement, if it fits that criteria, is going to be a really great, cheap, efficient way of providing cooling for your area. So you've known your space, you know what you're going to put in, and you know your resources. So the resources tells you how cool does the room stay, how much power do I have to have, and of course, over on the sideline, your inbound outbound connectivity. That would be your ISP provider. So with that being said, the next question is cost. Okay, if you're in the basement, you're actually surprisingly going to find out that you can run any kind of power you basically want from your main breaker or your CPC breaker. By going over to there and pulling that voltage off of there and putting it in as a receptacle or two receptacles and so on, will give you the ability of powering something pretty sizable. But I really don't recommend any more than 2 or 4 20 amp circuit breakers. That's a lot of power, and it can be wasteful, so you have to be careful. But the basement is the most optimal. Now, if you're in a room up above on a second floor or higher, or in the basement, that's a cost. You're going to have to run a power feed or tap into somewhere in that floor another source or another breaker to bring over the power you would need to power, let's say, 6 2U servers or something like that, or a storage array and some other gear. The overall goal here is that you realize what you've got and then what you can do with that to give yourself your full capacity. Now, the last component to that is, again, going back to air circulation. How much cost are you going to have to modify that room so it has AC? And I have to understand, you're doing that for air circulation, but that's not optimal. The truth of the matter is, there has to be some type of way of controlling that cooling, kind of an independent nature. And so therefore, probably routing an exchange and a vent into that general area will help a lot with that, but that's costly and it can be really expensive. Vents are normally positioned throughout the house to take hot air, bring it back down to the basement where the HVAC environment is, circulate that with cool air to save money, and then send it back up into the house for cooling. And it is doable. You can do it. I've seen a few IT lab services that have done that. I've seen some who use the small rooms underneath the stairwell, which is kind of odd because, you know, you've got that 45-degree angle of the stairs, right? And then you got this Kajimaj triangulated kind of set up little partial area, and then you're trying to cram something in there, and it's about using space pseudo-efficiently, but in reality you're not, because you picked an area and you picked a place that is active and is going to have traffic flow through, which means it's going to have what's called cavitation effect, which is also going to lead to potential dust buildup. And so those areas are going to be more prone for dust buildup because they're in an area of traffic. Going to somewhere where there's not much activity, the air is fairly stable, and people don't go around it is smarter. Hence the mindset of looking into the far corner of a basement, or in my case, my lab is an actual third-car garage that I built in here to be able to do that and make it work. Now the next thing that's important is understand your power. Let's say you're just starting and you're going to use a whole pile of micro Raspberry Pi platforms, and you got your Raspberry Pis, you got a whole bunch of them, right? And that's fine to run on a 15 amp circuit, on a couple of surge strips. You have like 8 or 9 of them, to give you a nice little cluster that you can do things with, which is really cool and very, very functional. And then you kind of set yourself up so that you want to make sure that you can also shield your gear so that it's not susceptible to problems or conditions. What do I mean by that? Well, your resources. Number 3, rule 3. How do you protect your resources? Well, there are 2 or 3 different ways. One, in my lab, because it's a more sophisticated lab, I have a silver wall, if you noticed here. And this silver wall is designed to produce an RF shielding effect. This is a Class B environment, which means when I do stuff in here, I can expect it to be functioning very similar to a Class B server environment, which is heavily insulated, well conditioned, and power is protected. So that means, okay, if I buy myself this little nook in the crook inside the back end of my stairwell, and I'm going to make myself a cool little thing, I'm going to put some RF shielding in there. That can be a small amount. You don't need much of that for a Raspberry Pi. It's just basically a grounded metal framing, that the units can sit on. That will take care of your RF needs. But you want to ground everything out. And the problem, unfortunately, with the avenue of Raspberry Pis is you see this guy right here. He's your problem. Now, the reason why he's your problem is because he is negative positive. That's it. And this is a Raspberry Pi. It's got the little switch in it and everything like that, and that means this is a direct current device. And the problem with direct current devices is they're not grounded. So what you need to do is to take some time and ground your power, and then take it into a conditioner setup. And a conditioner is the minimum I would say you would want to do with your system. The conditioner kind of breaks the power from the wall into a small microsecond separation, and then that power there is conditioned power. It's clean power. The voltage is well regulated. It's not going to give you any grief, and you can get those in what we call line conditioners. Advanced PDUs have them built into them as well. So if you got yourself like a Dell 19-inch Dell Rack a Dell Rack PDU, let's say a 6-prong or an 8-prong output, it will have the conditioner built into it. Or if you want to, use an UPS. UPS is perfect. I mean, your stuff will stay running when the power goes out, and it will run for quite a while until you run out of power, or you've sent a command to all your Raspberry Pis to shut down gracefully so they don't crash, right? So with that being said, the next part of that equation and discussion rises, okay, I've got everything set up. I have some RF shielding protection. I've got my grounding. I've got a line conditioner of sorts, right? And you've grounded your rack. Make sure you do not use wood in any of your housings or build-out structures. Don't do that. Now, you can screw into wood, but you also want to make sure that your rack is grounded to the natural ground of your receptacle box. Now, that would be the center post screw in a normal R5 plug. And so, when you look at the 2 plugs in a wall, you'll see there's a screw in the middle, and that is grounded. So you can put a grounding strip on there with a green wire and run it over to your rack, and you're grounded to the same source of the ground as your power is. And that should be sufficient. And with that, you're pretty much done. You've measured your space for what you want to do with what you've got, and you've got the resources that you can work with to make this thing work so your gear stays cool, condition powered well, and is able to be fairly safe in its location. Listen, my suggestion on that is have some fun with this. You don't need the complexities of what we call active cooling, where you have a system that creates cold air and circulates it in the room. Play with it some. Have some fun with the heat sinks. Have some fun with other things. Learn a little bit. You might be surprised at the cool things you can get away with, because it does work. And, it's how you guys learn, right? Well, this is Brad Dyke. I'm signing off with you guys. Make sure if you have any questions to put it down in the comments. Like if you like. Our whole goal here is to be helpful and to be able to get you in a successful place, right? So that you can really grow and become that person that you need to be as you go forward. With that being said, this is Brad Dyke signing off. God bless and have a blessed week. Take care.